Hey everyone, I am Robert Chandler from Scions of War Gaming Club. Uh, this is our first Advanced Tactics workshop, and I'd like to welcome you all to this workshop for Warhammer 40K. In this workshop, we are going to discuss army list building. We're going to cover how to go about building a list that will allow you to make the most of your army's strengths and score you points in the mission. Now, this workshop is primarily focused on matched play, and as such, we will focus on the rules and missions in the chapter-approved Grand Tournament mission pack. So my approach in this workshop comes from the standpoint of building an army list that is designed with competitive play in mind. Now, before we begin, before we deep dive into army list building, I want to first discuss identifying your play style. This is something that most new players have a lot of difficulty determining, and some players can shift between various play styles successfully, while others really can only play within a certain type of play style. But it's important to really understand what play style you enjoy most or play best with, and choosing an appropriate faction within that play style. Now, I've listed a few different playstyles here. Note, these aren't necessarily exclusive, and some armies can combine different playstyles together. The rest of this workshop will be based on the assumption that you have identified the playstyle that you enjoy, and we will get into how to build around that. Also, you need to understand that the meta is not static. It is ever-changing, and from time to time you may have to revisit this method in order to make adjustments or changes to your army. Some of the examples of play styles are speed or finesse, aggressive pressure, threat saturation, gun line, armies that are based around durability, combat oriented, psychic focused, hordes armies, and MSU or minimum size units. And of course you can have different armies can combine several different play styles together, usually one or two of them together, but you really need to understand what your play style is to really make the most of building an army list that's going to emphasize your ability to play. So moving on, we're going to talk about the swarm method of list building for Warhammer 40K because, of course, everyone loves a good acronym, right? The swarm method is not exactly a step-by-step guide, but rather it emphasizes a culmination of the entire process of creating a solid army list capable of competing in match play games. I'm going to break down each part of the process, and we'll talk about how they all fit together or build upon other steps in this process. Each and every unit choice and war gear choice should have a purpose in your list. Every unit you select should have a role in your army. So the swarm method being strengths, weaknesses, army composition, resources, and missions. Okay, so let's talk strengths first. First, we need to identify your chosen factor strengths. And what does your army do well? And the first step is identifying that. Maybe it's a fast-moving army with good shooting, or maybe it's a highly durable army that is hard to remove. Maybe it's a combat-oriented army. Whatever it is, identify the army's strengths. And this is done by looking over your chosen faction's core rules, such as their chapter tactic, legion trait, craft world trait, hive fleet ability, etc. And find out what it is that your army does well. That is your army's identity, and your build will be primarily focused on what the army's core strength is. Next, you need to understand what units that you have access to in your codex that enhances your army's strengths. What units help you get the most benefits, and what characters can be used to enhance those strengths. A good example of this is in Tyranids and the Kronos Hive Fleet adaptation. In the Chronos High Fleet adaptation, they get the ability to reroll ones to hit when shooting if the firing unit doesn't move in the movement phase. So what is a unit that can really benefit from that strength? Well, when we look at the unit data sheets in the Tyranid Codex, we find Hive Guard, who have a 36-inch range weapon that does not need line of sight to shoot, thus it won't need to move often, if ever, with a high strength, AP, and damage. This is a perfect unit that can complement that army's strengths in a Chronos High Fleet. You want to take a look over your codex and find units that enhance your army's core strengths. And this will be the core of your army by which the rest of the pieces will build around. Next, what abilities do you have access to that can enhance these strengths even further, be it in form of character bonus, unit bonuses, relics, warlord traits, psychic power, stratagems, or other abilities? What do you have access to that can really beef these abilities up? In other words, how can we enhance the strength of your army even further? Next, we'll talk about weaknesses, and as important as it is to understand and build upon your army's strengths, your army's weaknesses should not be ignored. Okay, all armies in the game have things that they are good at and things that they are not so good at. Craft Worlds, for example, is a fast, mobile shooting army. Death Guard, on the other hand, is not fast at all and doesn't have quite the shooting potential, although they are pretty good themselves. Don't try and force your army to be something it's not designed to be. And weaknesses are also not simply limited to what your army cannot do, but also what it's weak against. For example, if you play Tau, you understand your army has practically zero psychic defense. So your army has a major vulnerability to armies that have psychic strengths. So after you've taken an objective look at your army's weaknesses, what can you do to mitigate those weaknesses? Do you even have any options? Can you build a plan around those weaknesses? If, for example, you are playing Tau and you're weak against psychic powers, perhaps you will include drones and expendable troops in your list to act as smite targets, saving your important units like Riptides and Crisis Suits from being targeted by psychic powers where possible. But don't overinvest in trying to mitigate weaknesses, and understand that not all weaknesses can even be mitigated. It's more important really to understand what those weaknesses are, and if possible, think about ways you can minimize the impact in the case you're in a lopsided battle. Which comes to the third point here, which is understanding your army's limitations. Now, as we mentioned above, don't force your army to be something it's not meant to be. Understand your army's strengths and its weaknesses and the limitations. Having this objective view of your army will help both improve your list building and your play on the table. Don't focus all your energy and effort in mitigating every possible weakness in your list. It's more important to build around your strengths. But at the same time, you also need to really have a firm understanding of what your army's weaknesses are. Army composition. Okay, again, these steps are not step by step. They all kind of build on each other in this process, and you'll find that you'll go back and forth throughout this process, bouncing things back and forth between the different parts of it. But it's important to understand how your army will need to be composed to make the most of the army strengths, which is what we want to do here, right? It's important to identify the core elements of your list. And the core elements being those units that provide your army with the highest potential for its strengths. In the example above, I named Tyranids of High Fleet Chronos and the Hive Guard unit. Now, we might also take a Neurothrope in there to enhance their output with psychic powers, or Exocrines to benefit from strats and psychic powers. Now we have identified the core units in our list. These are the units that are going to have the biggest influence on how you engage with your opponent in the game to remove his units or score points on the mission. Then you need to identify the supporting pieces you want to put around those core units, be it in terms of characters or whatever other types of layered buffs that you're going to have. You need to identify what units will be your core and your support units, and how best to utilize them in your army build. If you are playing Iron Hands, for example, you may have identified that the core components are going to be heavy support choices. But a battalion detachment only lets you take 3 of those choices, and you need more. So maybe you need to include a spearhead detachment to ensure you can take the choices that you need to enhance your army strengths. And finally, you should be concerned about building a plan for your games and designing around it. At this point, we'll pause until we get to the missions part of that, and we can circle back to building a plan for your games, because the choices you make in mission secondaries will determine how you're going to build your plan. And the next part is resources. It's important to identify the resources you need to make your army work as the game progresses, and how you will use those. Command point expenditures are one of the most delicate things to balance in the game, and you should have a general plan on how and when you expect to use your strats for the game. How much CP it will require compared to how much CP you actually have to use. You must ensure that your army list is capable of handling the CP expenditures over the course of a game. In the example above, I mentioned the Iron Hand Spearhead. Yes, it allows you to get access to more units that can benefit from your army's chapter tactic, but it also costs 3 command points to get that detachment. How many command points will you start the game with after your pre-game expenditures? Can you afford to spend pre-game CP to give characters relics and warlord traits that you want them to have to enhance their strengths? If you don't have enough CP to fuel your army where you need it to, then it can be detrimental to your army list. A good army list is one that balances the core strengths in your build against the CP expenditures and the ability to play the missions well. There are other resources that you have to manage besides command points in your game. Thousand Suns and Cabal points come to mind. It's an additional resource available that can really enhance your army's psychic phase, which of course is one of the core strengths of that army. But to get Cabal points requires having certain units, and in some cases upgrades. Do you have the right units? Do you have enough Cabal points? Do you have more than you need? Same with resources in other armies such as AdMech. You can use different canticles each turn, but does your list synergize with the canticles you want to use on the various turns of the game? It's important to identify the key stratagems and abilities you need to ensure you use first and foremost. Break these down and prioritize them. Not all of them might be CP expenditures either. For example, a Space Marines list, you might have a balanced list of shooting and melee. You might consider adding a chapter master in your list and have a plan for how you're going to use his reroll ability every turn. In the first 2 turns, he will provide the rerolls to a Redemptor Dreadnought, say, or a squad of attack bikes. And by turn 3, he's giving those rerolls to Blade Guard veterans who are now in melee. So you need to have a good understanding of what your resources are and how you're going to use them ahead of the game. How many you need, and it's not limited simply to command points, although that is a big part of it. And finally, we get to missions. The missions probably play the most critical role in this process after identifying the army strengths. Again, we're focused on the chapter-approved GT mission pack, which contains a set of 9 missions used in competitive play. Now, each mission has a primary, which stays the same throughout. Hold an objective, or hold 2 out of 3 or hold 2 objectives, hold 3 objectives, or hold more objectives. And then there's a list of secondaries to choose from. So you must have a plan for scoring primary points. Maybe you plan on using cheap units that are easy to hide. Maybe you're going to flood the board with hordes of obsec bodies to keep the opponent off of objectives. But it's important to understand that the objectives are going to present key areas of the board where most of the engagements with the enemy will take place, because you're both fighting for those key areas for points. You need to have units in your list designed to hold objectives in your own territory, as well as units capable of getting your opponent off of their own objectives. You should also build around scoring particular secondaries. This is the biggest hurdle I see from players when it comes to list building for 9th edition. A good army list will be one that focuses on 2 to 3 secondaries that it's capable of scoring, regardless of what the opponent's bringing in the game. And these secondaries should always be ones that build upon the strengths of your army. Is your army very fast or mobile? Then engage on all fronts is a good core one to use every game. Does your army have good psychic potential? Maybe you should focus on warp ritual or psychic interrogation. You should have a plan for at least 2 secondaries you can always lean on no matter what, but preferably 3. That way, if you get to the table and you're playing a list that is tough and doesn't offer you much in the way of secondaries, you have options built in to get you points. And you want to avoid giving your opponent an easy choice for secondaries from your list if possible. Sometimes it's not possible to do this, and understand that's a potential weakness in your list going into a game. And you'll have to play with that in mind. But where you can avoid it, do so. Do you really need 4 or 5 characters in your list? I mean, maybe you do if you're, say, Thousand Suns and your army relies heavily on characters with psychic powers. But if you're playing, say, Space Marines, do you need that many? Or are you just giving your opponent 15 points on assassination? But you should, at a minimum, know exactly how many points your list does give up in the various categories your opponent can pick for secondaries that are reliant on destroying your units. Next, we're going to, that's basically the swarm method, but next we're going to talk about a particular subject of net lists, or as I like to call them, list resources. I'm going to talk about them here because I think it's important to talk about net lists, because I think it's important to look at other players' lists. I think that has a lot of value. You can gain a lot of information by reviewing lists that have performed well at events and trying to break down what the lists do and how they function. Fortunately, there are plenty of great resources for Army list reviews. Goonhammer has weekly articles they do called Competitive Innovations. And these articles, they highlight several major events and the top lists in those each week. They go a step further by attempting to break down the Army lists and why they work, which is nice. 40kstats.com also has weekly updated lists of the top 4 at major events across the globe. Now, there's not so much in the way of analysis here, but rather just access to raw top lists. And finally, Best Coast Pairings, the Players app. Now, this one is different in that it requires a subscription. Personally, I think it is one of the few resources worth a monthly sub to use if you're into competitive play. This allows you to view any list from any event, regardless of the placing. Now, of course, granted that being the lists were uploaded, but I'd say roughly 90% of them are. You can search by faction, you can filter by dates and times and weekends and whatever. You can search by factions, by events, find out what lists had most success at events based on your favorite faction. You can view the entire rankings of major events with lists. If you're seriously considering competing at Tournament 40K, then a BCP Players app sub is to me an absolute must, as it is going to be your best resource for keeping up with the meta and what armies are performing well at events. I didn't feel it was fair to talk about list building without touching on this subject. There is a lot of value out there in reviewing other people's lists and looking at what lists are performing well. And one of my favorite things to do is actually go to BCP or 40K Stats or Goonhammer or wherever, look at those lists, and then try to really kind of figure out how those lists function. Why did this person take this unit? Why did they take that unit? What is it that they're trying to do? So I think it's valuable to look at those sites and to go out and peruse for list resources so you can get an idea of what's working, and it helps give you ideas that maybe you hadn't considered before in your own army lists. The one mistake I will say is, and I see this commonly, is that people go out and see a list on one of these sites and really without analyzing the play style or how it works or how it functions, or they just copy the net list because it won an event or it placed highly in an event, and they build it and try to play it, and then they realize that they don't have any clue or concept of what it does or how it works. That is a mistake. Now you really need to understand what you're looking at and break those things down. And you could really even just use this method kind of to reverse engineer a list to kind of figure out what it's wanting to do. What missions is it wanting to play? What is its strengths? Why did they choose that relic? Why did they choose those warlord traits? What is it trying to do? Because generally speaking, it's all part of a machine that combines together, and that's what we want to do in our army list building, really. So I'm going to give an example of putting this into use. Okay, and I'm going to give the example of my my current Blood Angels list and why I've chosen the units that I've chosen. I'm going to leave this up here briefly so people can kind of take a look at it. Why, and I've included the warlord traits and the relics and things like that because those types of things are important, as well as the command points. But you can see I have a battalion. I start the game after pre-game CP expenditures with 8 command points. I have Commander Dante. I have a Primaris Chaplain on bike with a bunch of warlord traits and some relics, and his canticles listed there. I have a Sanguinary Priest. I have some Incursors, some Intercessors, Assault Intercessors, Blade Guard Vets, some Sane Guard, 10 Vanguard Vets, and the Sergeant has a Mastercrafted Lightning Claw, 2 Redemptors, and a Whirlwind. And this list is right at $19.99. And I'm going to go through and just break it down a little bit. I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but I do want to cover. What it's trying to do. So let's just break down the swarm method and with this list. First, we're identified the strengths here with this army. It's fast moving. It's a combat-oriented army because the chapter tactic for Blood Angels gives me +1 to advanced charge rolls, +1 to wound when I am charged, perform a charge, or a heroic intervention. And as a Space Marine army, it's relatively durable. I have Blade Guard and Vanguard Veterans in there that have a 2-up, 4-up. Invulnerable, and then I have Sanguinary Guard that have a 2-up save. The Dreadnoughts are relatively durable with Dreadnought with damage reduction, and the characters are fairly durable as well, specifically the Primaris Chaplain. But it does have some weaknesses, and I'm going to identify those weaknesses here and point them out here. And it has mediocre shooting. It does have decent shooting. You know, it's not great shooting. It's not horrible shooting. The Redemptors provide some good fire support for it, for the list, but it's mainly a combat army, and that's what we focus on as our strength. So we understand that it has mediocre shooting compared to many other armies, which is going to affect how we play this army on the table. It also has a low model count. It's an elite army. It's a Space Marine army. This is not a horde army. It doesn't have the number of bodies that orcs will have, or demons, or any of the various other higher model count armies in the game, Tyranids, for example. And this particular list does not have any psychic defense at all. I don't have any relics, warlord traits, war gear. I don't have a librarian. I have no stratagems to help me with psychic. It has 0 psychic defense. That is a weakness in this list. Okay. Next, we'll talk about the army composition. How is it put together? Well, it's a battalion detachment, because most of the units that I'm running, the core elements are Sanguinary Guard, Vanguard Veterans. Those are all elite choices, of which the battalion detachment allows me to take up to 6 of. So a battalion gives me plenty of options without having to spend command points for a detachment, which is important because I need those command points to fuel my stratagems, which we'll talk about next. What are my resources? And again, with resources, we're talking about not just command points, but other abilities, right? The Sanguinary Priest is critical in this role in this army list because he allows my army to have access to the Assault Doctrine early in the game, which is a big boost because, again, it enhances my army's strengths. It gives me an extra attack in combat because I'm Blood Angels, and also it gives me extra AP on all my combat attacks. So being able to put a unit into the Assault Doctrine in the first 2 turns of the game is pretty important. It builds on my strength. I have characters that allow me rerolls. Dante has the Chapter Master ability. He can pick a unit and give them rerolls. Typically early in the game, I'm doing that with my Redemptor Dreads, and then maybe later in the game, I'm doing it with other units like Blade Guard Vets or Vanguard Veterans. I also have the Chaplain in there. The Chaplain, as the Warlord, gives the Sanguinary Guard +1 to hit, and then he has a litany that allows him to reroll hit rolls in combat. So I have synergy there with my characters. They're all supporting the core units of my army. I have 8 command points to start with, and 13 that I will use throughout the game. And I have identified several stratagems that I lean on. But an example of this is Suppression Fire with the Whirlwind, which again forces a unit to fight last or turns off Overwatch, and that's a critical piece that improves the strength of my army. And then finally, for the missions aspect of it, my go-to mission secondaries on this are Engage on All Fronts, Oaths of Moment, which is a Space Marine secondary, which allows, I get 2 points for putting a unit within 6 inches of the center. I have Blade Guard Veterans to really hold that for me, as well as characters later in the game. I have and then I get another point for not failing morale. The Chaplain has a 6-inch aura of Leadership 9, which really helps boost the Marines' leadership and makes it much harder for them to fail. My third choice is usually Raise the Banners High, and the reason you'll see that in this list and why that works is I have lots of infantry units. Characters are all infantry except the Primaris Chaplain, who is on a bike, and the Dreads and the Whirlwind. Everything else is infantry. So I have the ability to raise banners in the early game with like intercessors and incursors who can deploy in the neutral zone onto an objective that you wouldn't normally be able to deploy onto and get a banner up early. And I have Sanguinary Guard and Vanguard Veterans that can go out and pop banners later in the game because those are also scored at the end of the game as well. So those are the 3 that I lean to. Now, they might change depending on mission or opponent. If I'm playing against an opponent that has, say, a bunch of vehicles that I feel I can reasonably destroy to get more points than I could off of, say, Raise the Banners, I might take that instead. Might take Bring It Down instead. I've also identified the points here that my army list gives up. I only give up 6 points for Bring It Down because of the Whirlwind and the 2 Redemptors. I give up 10 points for Assassination because I have 3 characters, which are 3 each, and +1 for killing the Warlord if you kill him. And I give up a total of 8 points for No Prisoners. And that's all I give up in the list, really. So it makes it tougher for my opponent to pick, because if they're going into the match reliant on what I'm taking to pick secondaries, then they're limited in what they actually can take. And the best option for them to take is Assassination. My Warlord in the list, who is the Primaris Chaplain on bike, is incredibly durable. I've given him the Armor Indomitus, so he has a 2-up armor save, an extra wound, and once per game a 3-up invulnerable save. I've given him the Warlord trait of Gift of Foresight, which lets me reroll a hit, save, and wound roll once per turn, so I can use it to reroll his saves. And then I given him a second Warlord trait, which allows him to take a second relic, which is the Adamantium Mantle, which gives him a 5-up to ignore wounds. So he goes from a Primaris spike that's T5 with 8 wounds now that I can use Transhuman on, that I can reroll saves for, and then get 5-up to ignore wounds. So he's very hard to bring down for that, for those 4 points if they choose Assassination against me. So that's the swarm method in a nutshell. This method is by no means the definitive method. I feel that its application can improve your list building by remembering the core concepts, specifically knowing your army strengths and weaknesses, understanding how you can build upon your strengths, and compose an army built around a core, what resources you need to make that core and make your army tick, and how your army plans to engage in the mission in terms of scoring primary and secondary points. Again, it's not a step-by-step method, and oftentimes you'll bounce between the categories in determining how your list will be designed. Each part of the process links with the other parts, and each is equally important. I hope you've enjoyed the workshop and find the information valuable and informative, and maybe you can use the method to improve your own list building capabilities. So go forth and purge. Thanks for watching.